Hello there, my very good friends. Andy Murray here for What Culture Wrestling, and Vice's Dark Side of the Ring series is back, which means this video series is back as well. We're going to start with the very first episode, the second part of which went down last night after the first part dropped last week. It's on Brian Pillman. Now, what we usually do with these videos is focus on, well, I mean, you can tell by the title, right? The things you may not have known going into the episode. You know that Brian Pillman was the loose cannon. You know that this guy had a horrific car accident that effectively ruined his career. We're going to leave those bigger picture topics that you probably already know all about alone and focus on the smaller things instead. And as usual, with these Dark Side of the Ring videos, we cover topics chronologically as they go down in the episode. They're not ranked, it's all in the order that they aired. So let's just get this thing started. I'm Andy for What Culture Wrestling, and here are 10 things that we learned from Dark Side of the Ring, Brian Pillman. Number 10, the origins of that gravelly voice. If you've ever heard Brian Pillman cut a promo, you know that the guy basically sounded like he was swallowing shards of glass all the time, and there's a good reason for that. This story is told early on in the first part of the episode by Brian's sister, Linda, who goes into detail on the sheer amount of times that this poor guy had to have surgery to have polyps scraped from his vocal cords. He had this surgery around 40 different times, taken in the hospital, scraping those things out, and eventually resulting in the wear and tear on his vocal cords that made him sound so gravel-throated. In fact, Linda told this particularly crazy story about one time how their mother came home, middle of the night, comes into Brian's room and he's breathing heavily, he's really struggling. They phone an ambulance and the ambulance takes them straight to the doctor's house. At that moment, the doctor puts Brian on his dining table and performs an emergency tracheotomy. That must have been when they knew this thing was really, really serious. And every time he had these surgeries, Brian couldn't speak for 2 to 3 weeks at a time. Jim Cornette later joked that he tried to overcompensate for that when he got to wrestling by trying to speak all the time. Number 9, Steve Austin didn't want to be in the Hollywood Blondes. The Hollywood Blondes is one of the most famous periods of Brian Pillman's career. Not quite as famous as the Loose Cannon, of course, but it was a formative stage for him and Steve Austin in WCW. And when Steve Austin learned of the plan to do this, he was backstage. Pillman just came up behind him and said, "Hey buddy, we got to think of a tag finisher." Austin wasn't happy. He saw himself as a singles guy at the time. He liked being a singles guy because it meant he didn't have to rely on anyone but himself. And of course, the usual concerns came into play for Austin. They're just throwing us together, they've no plan, they've no idea what they're doing. This isn't going to end well for us. This isn't going to go well. Pillman and Austin did the only thing they could, and that was try to make the most of it. They travelled the roads together, they formed a close friendship, they fine-tuned and refined the act, and they made the Hollywood Blondes into something to the degree that by the time they split up, Steve Austin was gutted that WCW had pulled them apart. Number 8, Brian took the blame for Rochelle's death. So there are a lot of tough topics on this episode, and understandably so. Brian Pillman had a lot of darkness in his life, and one of the most harrowing stories of all revolves around the death of Rochelle, who is the mother of his daughter, Brittany, and his ex-partner. There was a custody battle between Brian and Melanie, who he married, of course, later on, and Rochelle. And it doesn't go well for Rochelle. Brian and Melanie get full custody. When this happens, Rochelle phones up Brian, trying to get him on the phone, trying to talk things through. She gets Melanie instead. And Melanie tells her, "Even your own mother told me that I would be a better mother to your kids." Now this has an understandably devastating impact on Rochelle, who phones up her mother, tells her exactly what she's going to do, and then commits suicide. It's a real horrible and monstrous situation, obviously, and Melanie admits that she never should have done any of it. She never should have stooped so low as to try and take a mother's kids away from her. But it happened, and Brian was destroyed. He told Mel that we're responsible for this. We pushed her too far. We put far too much pressure on her. And it's quite understandable, if you have even a slightest shred of empathy, to understand when Brittany says that woman is the devil, speaking of Melanie. It must have been, I can't even comprehend how horrible that must have been, put it that way. Number 7, the true horror of his accident. Obviously, the Humvee accident that Brian Pillman had a devastating impact on his career, but you knew that already. What we're going to talk about is the extent of his injuries, which, in the account from Linda, his sister, is horrendous. It's gross. It's disgusting. When Melanie went to the hospital to see her husband, she didn't recognize him. His eyes were all red, everything was swollen. She said straight up, "That's not my husband. Who's this guy?" before realizing, of course, that it was him. Linda's account is nuts. Brian's head was swollen up, in her words, like a beach ball. He had six individual doctors to deal with just all the various parts of his face that were shattered. And when he had the metal plates put into his face, do you want to know what they did? Do you want to know how they had to put those plates in? Basically, they cut his face and they peeled it down. That is horror movie stuff. And as far as the ankle injury that effectively doomed his career goes, at one point Linda describes it as hanging off the side of the bed. Stomach churning. Number 6, how convincing the loose cannon really was. The loose cannon is, of course, Brian Pillman's most successful gimmick, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality in a way that wrestling had never ever seen before. But the gimmick was so effective that it was actually to a damaging degree, because when Brian had this automobile accident and effectively ruined the rest of his life, fellow wrestlers thought it was a work. Jim Cornette told this story, talking about how Brian had everyone duped to such a level that they were like, maybe he put it on, maybe he's doing it for publicity, maybe it didn't happen. And Cornette even told this story about a rumor that some of the wrestlers had made up, stating that Brian had actually gone in for plastic surgery so he could look more like Shawn Michaels, go to WWE and face Shawn Michaels for the title as a heel. Ridiculous. But that's the extent to which Brian had everyone fooled, and it got so bad that when Brian Pillman Jr. was speaking about his father's death, he was sitting there, all of them, they were in a big huddle, crying, grieving and everything else, and he was sitting waiting for a camera crew to show up, thinking it was all part of an act. Personally, I cannot think of a more extreme example of a character or an extension of Brian's personality, which is ostensibly what the loose cannon really is, having such an impact on something as severe as the guy, first his automobile accident, and then him passing away. Number 5, how Brian refused to accept his injuries. So there's some really interesting stuff from Jim Ross here. He was WWE's head of talent relations, and when Brian was hurt, obviously he signed with the company hurt, but he transitioned over to commentary for a while, and JR said this made him feel like less of a man. He didn't want to be a commentator. JR was trying to sell him on the lifestyle, saying, hey, you can still contribute positively in wrestling without hurting your body even further. But all Brian wanted to hear was for Jim to tell him that everything was going to be okay and he was going to be the wrestler he once was. Jim Ross said that he couldn't do this because he'd be lying to him. But Pillman's injuries were so bad and made worse by his insistence on carrying on as a wrestler that Dave Meltzer on this episode said that wrestlers told him he could barely walk going through airports. Steve Austin corroborated this. He said he saw it with his own eyes, Brian limping around in the airport and then going and taking bumps in matches. But he figured, it's just Brian. He's a man's man. He'll deal with it. He'll be fine. If he's not audibly complaining about it, then, there's no reason to be worried. Later, of course, we found out that there very much was. JR's intervention. Eventually things got so bad that Jim Ross, was tipped off that, hey man, something bad's going on with Brian. Can you intervene here? Can you get him checked out? And JR on the episode knew straight away that this wasn't going to go well. He did his job regardless, though, because Jim Ross is a professional. He arranged for Brian to be drug tested. And yes, Brian did not take this well. Brian called Jim Ross up and told him, I cannot believe you have betrayed me. You of all people, you looked after me, you put your arm over me, you guided me through this business, and now this. When in reality, all Jim was trying to do was protect the guy, and he said that to Brian. He said, Brian, I'm just trying to save your life. All the drug tests found at the time were prescription pills and steroids, which, while obviously devastating, were not the things that they were necessarily looking for. And hearing Jim Ross talk about this is particularly troubling. He talks about how it was his job to kind of convince Brian that he could continue in wrestling in a way that was less damaging to him. And Jim feels, ultimately, that he failed. Number 3, the infamous Melanie Pillman interview. So it's the Raw after Brian Pillman dies, and you've probably heard about this, right? Vince McMahon putting a grieving Melanie Pillman live on air and grilling her about her husband's death to try and absolve WWE of any blame in the matter, really. And Melanie admits on the episode that she agreed to do it. She didn't feel pressured or anything else. Now, what kind of frame of mind she's in at the time while she's grieving and everything else, you know, it's a difficult situation to analyze. But the one thing that sticks out from this whole portion, obviously putting a grieving widow on TV in such a state is horrendous in the first place. But Melanie specifically said to Vince McMahon, hey, don't mention prescription pills. He had a problem, but we don't have the death certificate back. I don't want to comment on that until we know for sure. You think you'd respect the grieving widow's wishes, right? You'd go, okay, fair enough. Well, you know, this is gross anyway, but we're not going to ask that part about it. It's the first question that Vince McMahon asks. It's all about prescription pills, isn't it? You know, watching this clip back has always been uncomfortable, but knowing that, even more so. Number 2, the downward spiral. Things understandably spiraled out of control when Brian passed away. It was a horrible situation for all the kids. The 3 who are mentioned and interviewed and covered on the show are Danielle, or Danny, Brittany, and Brian Pillman Jr., obviously. They all went off to their respective mothers' houses or their guardians' houses, and each of them just had a horrific story to tell. Brittany spoke about how, you know, they went from living this good life as the family of a wrestler to the lights being shut off and, you know, not being able to feed and everything else. And Brian Pillman Jr. sitting there talking about how Melanie remarried and his stepdad was so abusive. He used to train these dogs to like viciously attack him whenever he was grounded and tried to stray from his room. And, you know, one time Brian Pillman Jr. comes home and he found Melanie passed out with a bottle of vodka by her. It is horrendous, horrendous stuff. But as is often the case with the darkest stories on these episodes, there's a light at the end of this, and that light is Linda Pillman. Linda, throughout this whole episode, just comes across as a saint, but none more so than towards the end when she's talking about bringing the kids together, getting them together once or twice a month to make sure that they didn't grow apart. You can, I mean, this is kind of a corny thing to say, man, but it's true. You can almost feel the love these people have for her and for each other radiating through the television screen when you're watching this episode. It's really touching stuff, and wait till you see the part with the spider. That's a hoot. Number 1, the legacy lives on. Brian Pillman Jr. is another part of the light, the shining light coming out of the episode at the end here. Obviously, he's in AEW right now. He's part of the Varsity Blondes. He's doing really well in his pro wrestling career, and it's interesting to hear the origin story of his wrestling career. It's Steve Austin phones him up out of the blue and says, hey buddy, I've got an old weightlifting belt from your father. I want to send it to you. I want to post it to you. How can I get it to you? Brian Pillman Jr. took this as a sign. That was the moment he chose to enter the wrestling business. And Melanie and his sisters and everyone else, they're understandably worried about this, knowing what it did to his father. But Melanie said specifically that once she saw him doing his thing and once she saw Brian Pillman Jr. perform, her son perform, she knew it was the right path for him. And Brian, obviously, man, I don't know how you can not root for Brian Pillman Jr. coming out of this episode. I don't know how he can instantly not be one of your favorite wrestlers. Because this guy is just, he's great. He's tremendous on the whole episode. He cracks up, obviously, when he's talking about his father, but he's talking about continuing the legacy and learning the lessons and everything else and wanting to be a good father himself as his father was to him. And Dark Side of the Ring always do a tremendous job of focusing on the humans impacted by this situation and how they've moved on. And you know, it's great to see Brian Pillman Jr. doing this every other week on Dark, Dynamite, or whatever else he's competing for AEW. All the power in the world to him, his siblings, and everyone else. Man, it's a rough life the guy's lived, Brian Pillman Jr., but he's making good on it now, and that's great to see. But anyway, guys, that's it. That's my breakdown of the first episode of the new series of Dark Side of the Ring on Brian Pillman. We will be back soon with another one of these videos. Like I say, we're probably sticking to the biggest topics only, but you will get more of them, so stick around. Anyway, you can follow us on Twitter at WhatCultureWWE. You can like, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. Then you can find me on Twitter at Andy H. Murray, where you can tell me how wrong I am. Goodbye.